This is WiseBox Podcast.
Podcast number 3, How Should I Study a Language? Our special guest on WiseBox Podcast is Daniel Thornhill. Dan has been a foreign language teacher and instructional designer for 26 years. A native New Yorker, he earned his bachelor's in Spanish from Oberlin College, and then went on to earn a master's in linguistics and education from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He has taught Spanish, French, linguistics, and teaching methods courses at the University of Illinois, Parkland College, and Florida Atlantic University, where he was the director of basic language for Spanish. More recently, he's been focusing on curriculum development and instructional design, designing over 50 language courses, foreign language courses, and teaching methods courses for clients, including the U.S. government. Dan, it's great to have you on. Today, we're diving into a big question for any language learner. How should I actually study a language, or how should I get started?
Chapter 1, Get Motivated.
So the first question I have for you, Dan, is how important is motivation in starting to acquire a language?
Well, thank you for having me. The first question, how important is motivation? So, you have to have a concrete purpose, I think, in order to learn a language, but let's qualify it first by saying, what level do you want to achieve? Do you want to get by? Do you want to hold down a job? Do you want to have an advanced level or a superior level of the language? So it all depends on what your goals are. But I would say no matter what your goal is, you kind of have to have a good reason. If you don't have a good reason to use the language, if you're not going to use the language regularly, you're going to struggle with learning it. So that's why so many people, I think, struggle with learning languages in schools. I think back to when I was a kid, what was my motivation in school? It was definitely lacking in some cases. So I would say if you don't have a concrete purpose or opportunities to use the language, it is going to be difficult. It's not going to be impossible. It's just going to take longer. You're going to see more sort of ups and downs. You're going to see more exaggerated what's called U-shaped behavior, where one day you're using the language really well for your level, and then other days you're going to be forgetting words or stumbling over words or forgetting, which grammar points to use, and then the next day could go back up. So that gets more pronounced the longer you go without using the language.
Dan, what about some tips for staying motivated when progress feels slow? And like you say, in this U-shaped kind of loop of progress, like some days are good, some days are not good for language learning. Well, how do you stay motivated?
So again, I think if you have a concrete purpose for using the language, that it becomes your motivation. And some would argue that motivation from the outside or extrinsic motivation is not as effective as motivation that comes from within or intrinsic motivation. But if you need to learn the language, you are going to learn it. Think about all the people who are immigrants, for example. They oftentimes in the United States, for example, they may take some formal English classes, they may not. But if you're working in the United States, you achieve a certain level of English over time just because you have to in many cases. So I would say if you have this kind of purpose, if you have these opportunities to learn to use the language, your motivation will be high, whether it's extrinsic or intrinsic, whether it comes from without or from within. So where you're going to see a problem is if you don't have regular opportunities to use the language, if you don't have a concrete purpose, your motivation then has to switch to something a little less pressing. So there I feel like the role of intrinsic motivation becomes more important. You have to really want it in that case, and you have to be disciplined. So when you don't feel like practicing, you have to practice, even if it's just 15 minutes a day, right? You have to make yourself do it, sort of like exercise, right? Like some days you're like really motivated. You hit the gym and you're there for like an hour and a half. Other days, you really have to drag yourself there. And I think learning a language is the same. Playing sports is the same. So if you played sports, for example, or if you currently play sport, you realize there's some days you really want to do it and some days you really don't. But regardless of what you want to do, you have to do it. So I would say if you have motivation from within, it's going to be easier.
Chapter 2, Make a Language Learning Plan.
let's move on to our second point, which is a learning language plan. So what I often tell aspiring language learners is that get a plan, whatever that plan is. What should that language learning plan consist of, Dan?
So the most basic thing it should consist of is consistency, if that makes sense. So it needs to be
Every day.
Every day, you need to be doing something with the language. Even if it's just 15 minutes, even if it's just 10 minutes, every day you need to be exposed to the language. You need to be using it for some sort of concrete purpose. Now, that can look like using a language app. If you're a little bit more advanced, it can look like listening to the news or reading the news in that language. Not just news, actually, it could be anything that you're interested in, but reading or listening in the language every day. So it just depends on your personal goals, your personal style. But I would say any plan that you put together has to include daily interaction with the language, a daily practice with the language. For beginners, there's a lot of language apps out there that can help you. I would say what you really want to look for in whatever program you choose to put together for yourself, the beginning of it has to be forgiving. So you have to be willing to make mistakes. You have to be willing to do some things that are repetitive. Right? Exercises that are repetitive help you build what's called automaticity so that the language comes to you quickly. Because part of communication is not just crafting a good message, let's say, in the sense of understandable, but the message has to be delivered quickly. You can't really communicate if you're talking or write. Well, writing is a little bit different. If you're talking very slowly, that can actually impede communication. So you want to make sure, I would say fast and with mistakes is better than slow and perfect.
I noticed on social media, there are a lot of language programs and language apps that make this assertion that stop memorizing language. Okay, so imagine a beginner learner saying, okay, if I can't memorize language, how do I get from here to the ability to communicate without that? Can you share your ideas on that?
Sure. So a good language program, a good language app, for example, or a good teaching program will actually have you memorizing little chunks of the language so that you can string those chunks together quickly. But there should be a transition point where those chunks then are analyzed. So if you notice that whatever you're using is just having you memorize chunks of language without you really ever delving into what those chunks are, that's probably not the best thing for even learning to get by in the language. So I would say you want to look for that transition point where the chunks then begin to be analyzed.
Okay, great.
So but you have to memorize vocabulary. I don't know.
There's no other way around it. Yeah.
Even if
and when you think about studying vocabulary, do you think the flashcard technique is better or learning vocabulary generally in some kind of relatable context?
So the best way to learn vocabulary is by reading. So as soon as you are able to try your hand at reading text in the language, the best way to learn vocabulary is by seeing vocabulary used in context, and you need to see it at least 8 to 12 times in context before you integrate that word into your vocabulary. So the more you read, even if it's just at the beginning, advertisements or infographics or, simple social media posts, seeing the word in context can really help. For most of the commonly taught languages, so those being like French, Spanish, German, and also I believe they're branching out into some of the less commonly taught languages, but it's Linguee, Linguee. If you Google that, it'll come up. And it's not AI powered, or maybe it is now, but what it does is you put a phrase in English and it'll show you that phrase in context. So let's say you want to learn how to say pass a test, right? Yeah. I passed the test, right? Because pass can have a lot of different meanings, right? So when you're thinking of how to use a word, you want to definitely put it in a little bit of a context. So how do we say pass a test in French? If you go to Linguee and write pass a test, it'll show you how that's rendered. It'll have the English version on the left and the French version on the right. And what it does is it searches through texts that have been translated professionally, and it gives you the options for the word or phrase that you're looking for. So that's a really good way to see words in context. So I think of the resources that are out there, Lingui is very strong.
Great.
It shows you phrases like that in context so that you can see how the whole idea is rendered. And I think that's an important thing to think about with vocabulary. You're not doing just words, you're trying to render entire ideas.
And so just to conclude, the whole idea of a language learning plan is set goals that are achievable in the short term, some kind of timeline, and then choosing wisely the materials and the resources that you use with a combination of some authentic resources that are from the host nation where they speak the target language.
But really, it doesn't matter what materials you use. It matters how much time you're spending. That's why I said whatever you do, it has to be every day. So find something you like and do it every day. And just make sure, like you said, in a way, but I'll put it perhaps a little bit more simply, is make sure that you are doing some practice where you are doing automaticity. So you're doing repetitive kinds of activities. And then also make sure that you are attaching meaning to the forms, to the words and the grammar that you're using.
Great.
So you have to have some of both.
Chapter 3, Silent Period.
Which language modality should learners focus on? Either listening or speaking, reading or writing? Which one should be emphasized more in the beginning?
So a lot of studies have shown that people who are learning a language need what's called a silent period, where they're not actively speaking or writing in the language. So when you start with a language, I strongly believe that you should start with listening and reading. And if you're learning a language that uses a different writing system than English, then maybe just focus on listening at first. Listen, get used to what the language sounds like, the rhythm of it. And then once you listen to some things, let's say for the equivalent of maybe 30 hours, right? Then you can start delving in. But I would say listening, the receptive skills are easier. Listening and reading are easier than speaking and writing. And then once you get a feel for the language in that sense, then I would start delving into it. Any kind of good materials are going to ask you questions about what you heard or what you read, but they're not going to ask you necessarily to translate everything. They're not going to ask you to produce too early. So you do need time to sort of integrate and think about the language before you start producing it. We see this in children as well. So children spend a lot of time actually listening to the language that they're learning in their home, or languages they're learning in their home. So they don't speak right away. And then they start to babble. And then the babbling turns into one word. And then one words become two words. And then two words become three. And then they gradually become more proficient. So people make a big deal about the differences between children learning languages and adults. There are differences, but I would say there's a lot of commonality as well. And one of those commonalities is having this sort of silent period where you're just listening.
Yeah, I think that's good for self-esteem as well. When you think about the idea, for example, of an absolute beginner, when someone actively studies a language, especially if they're interacting with language tutors or instructors, they usually have a little bit of knowledge. They've listened to the language. They know a few words.
Chapter 4, Ease into Grammar.
Let's move on to the next point. And this is the one that I think learners often place too much emphasis on, and it causes a lot of stress and anxiety for most students, is how important is grammar during the initial stages of language learning?
So I would say that's why it's important to start learning a few chunks, because without grammar, without some sort of order to what you're saying, it's going to be very hard for other speakers of the language to understand you. So that's why it's important in the initial stages of language learning that you're learning these chunks that you can string together. Then once you get a little bit more knowledge of the language, as I said, you start to analyze those chunks. So is grammar important? It is important for comprehension. Is it important for you to know every aspect of a language's grammar right from the beginning? No, it's not. So rules of thumb, like if you think about learning a language like Spanish, a lot of times when you learn it in school, they'll give you these rules of thumb, like the preterite is used for completed action. And if you see it with this set of adverbs, you know to use the preterite. That ends up giving you results like this, where a person who is trying to speak the language then pauses in the middle of what they say to like count off the rules of thumb. I've seen students do this, like they're counting on their hand notations and stuff. So I would say not only is vocabulary learned better in context, but grammar is also learned better.
Absolutely.
You need a lot of input in order to learn a language to any level. You need examples from the language. You need authentic examples. And so is grammar important at the beginning? Not as important, but you want to make sure, again, if you're trying to learn a language and you're trying to communicate with people, if what you're saying is gibberish, then, it's going to be hard. So you want to make sure that you're, again, learning those chunks at first, stringing the chunks together, and then moving on to more analytical uses of grammar. And what I would say too is just not to put too fine a point on it, but think about how you learned your dominant language, whatever language you spoke at home as a child. You didn't really learn abstract grammar rules. You got a lot of examples and you imitated those examples. And when you made mistakes, people tried to correct you, but time that didn't work, right? Think about every time you've interacted with a child, if you try to correct a child's grammar, they don't listen to you. What they're listening to are the examples of what you say.
Yeah, so some common things in the classroom that I've noticed as being a Spanish teacher for many years is that some students get obsessed with, for example, learning courtesy phrases like in English, like, I would like a pound of tomatoes or something like that. You're at the market and I like a pound of tomatoes. And then they start to analyze, like, I would like, what is that? What verb is that? Oh, would like. Okay, so this is the conditional. But is this really a condition? You're just asking nicely. So it's part of, not simply just, you can't analyze it at, oh, it's a conditional phrase, but really in the context, it's not, if you think about it. So students get obsessed with analyzing, well, I have to learn all these conditional verbs in order to say this, but in reality, you don't. So what would you say to a student that gets obsessed with analyzing grammar in the initial stages before you start analyzing that a little bit more as you move along, as you transition to more effective speaking?
So if a student is hung up on a detail, I would just put it out there. If you get hung up on details, it's going to slow you down. Because any kind of human endeavor requires a lot of practice. Practice makes perfect. Perfection doesn't make perfect. Like, you can't part with it. So practice makes perfect. Now, if you are teaching, if you're learning a language on your own using like apps and things like that, you have to have the discipline to recognize this in yourself and learn when to just let something go. But if you're learning it in a social context, in a class, then, I think an effective instructor acknowledges this, because people know that if the grammar is wrong enough, it will mess up the message and I won't be communicating. I mean, that's something that we all kind of know intuitively. So a good teacher, though, will, I hesitate to use the word good, and it sounds judgmental, but like an effective teacher will, draw your attention away from that and remind you that the overall message is more important than perhaps some of the, pickier grammar details will live in it. Also, though, I think any effective program, whether it's self-taught or whether you're learning in a social context, provides you quality explanations. And I think a lot of times the explanations we get for some of the points of language are not so great. Like, a lot of them rely on rules of thumb. A lot of them are using technical terms too that people don't understand. So like, as an English speaker learning Spanish, the grammar of English is very different than the grammar of Spanish. And so I've had all these teachers in my past that were like, it's the imperfect. Don't you know what the imperfect is? I'm like, no, English doesn't have that. English has past and non-past. We have run and ran. That's all we got. We don't have these categories that the languages descended from Latin have. So this idea that teachers would expect you to know these grammatical terms is frankly distracting, kind of annoying, and think too, like back to when we were learning about English as English dominant speakers, we learned like the noun, adjective kind of stuff. At least in my school system, we learned it in third grade, never returned to it. So third grade for me was 38 years ago. I don't remember what we talked about in third grade. Do you? And so there's this idea of, if you just know the grammatical terms, you'll know the language better. It can help, but I wouldn't get stuck on that either. You have to be reminded of the overall big picture and your overall goal. Your goal if your goal is understand the minute differences and details of grammar, that's a very advanced language learner's goal.
And the way I've approached grammar in the past, and I think it seems to relieve a lot of anxiety among students, is that when it's necessary, when there's a systematic error in a grammar form, instead of just, okay, I'm going to teach this grammar form, students have to listen, regardless of the fact that they already noticed the patterns. They understand the syntactical aspects and the verb paradigms and all that other stuff related to understanding grammar.
Yeah.
They understand it intuitively. Why do we need to allocate this window of time that can be sometimes up to 45 minutes or an hour when they've already grasped the pattern? So just do like a pop-up grammar, like when you see something pop up, okay, we'll talk about this now and then we'll move on. How do you feel about that?
As a teacher, though, I felt sometimes, so being a teacher is sort of like being an entertainer in a way. People want to be entertained in a way, but they also have expectations of what that's supposed to look like. So everyone has expectations of what learning is supposed to look like. And so if your teaching style violates too many of their expectations, they're going to tune you out.
That's a good point.
So I think an important part of being a teacher, I know this is kind of off topic, but an important part of being a teacher is learner-centeredness. This idea that you're taking the needs and expectations of the learner into account. So it's always good to acknowledge people's fears. So if they fear that what they're saying is grammatically incorrect, so much so that it's going to interfere with the message, you have to acknowledge that fear and say, you know, sometimes you're going to make mistakes. And yes, right, this may or may not impact the message. And I think giving them information about how much a grammatical point impacts the message is useful, perhaps even more useful than what the actual explanation of the grammar point is. So for example, if someone's hung up on grammatical gender, I would say, you know, not that meaning, it doesn't bear that much meaning, grammatical gender. If you say el calle, la calle, it's not like they don't understand that you're talking about the street, you know? So it's a way of encouraging students to pick their battles, I would say, you know, and you as their teacher kind of inform them on which battles they should be fighting at which point.
Chapter 5, The Truth About AI.
Why don't we move on to a very, very exciting topic, which is I've seen a lot of hype online for AI tutors, a few of them. And some of them start off well, but then they start to degenerate or deteriorate. And as far as for intermediate learners, for example, especially like maintaining some level of coherent conversation that leads to language growth, vocabulary growth, and increased grammatical competence, for example. And it seems like there's often an overload of corrective feedback, for example. What are your thoughts on the role of AI in language learning?
First of all, I want to acknowledge that the way artificial intelligence operates currently is incredibly damaging to the environment. The AI processing data centers that have been built require large amounts of water to cool them, and that is not great in a world where, you know, water is becoming more and more precious a resource. They also require immense amounts of power to operate them. And, you know, I don't have facts and figures, but I'm pretty sure green energy doesn't figure into much of that power that's being used. So AI has a large water usage footprint and it has a large carbon footprint. So I just want to put that out there, that if you are concerned about those issues, and I think as a living, breathing organism that lives on this planet, you probably should be, the use of AI really does leave a large environmental footprint. Secondly, it's always good to remember that the majority of the AI programs out there now have been trained on English primarily, and they've been trained using written language primarily. So if your goal is to speak a language, right, AI oftentimes will give you models that sound a lot more like written language, but you wouldn't know that if you're learning a language for the first time. So you wouldn't know what it sounds like spoken versus written. And I'm not just talking about accents and things like that. The way we speak a language is fundamentally different from the way we write.
So more like a textbook, more like textbook language. Not even.
Not even, because it's trained off the internet. So it's trained
Mhm.
off all kinds of different texts. But what all those texts have in common is that they're written language. So they're more carefully
Mhm.
curated. Spoken language has more sort of false starts. It has more errors in it. It's more repetitive. So if your goal is to speak a language, you really need good
Mhm.
models of spoken language. And I'm not sure we can get those from AI. However, what AI can absolutely help you do is build
Okay.
automaticity. So it's good for those sort of repetitive tasks. What I would say, though, about AI, I guess
Mhm.
my third point, fourth point, counting, but my about AI would be that it is programmed to be
Okay.
agreeable. And as we know in real life, other human beings are not
Yeah,
always
that's
agreeable. So in order to learn to speak a language, you have to learn how to cope with dealing with other people who have
mhm.
different goals, who have different motivations, who
Mhm.
are living their lives. And so AI exists to serve you. Other people don't exist to
Wow.
serve you. And what I've noticed is people interact a lot with AI, start interacting with people the same way, and people react very when you do that. So an AI is never going to push back on you. They're never going to contradict you. They're never going to be an authentic experience. So there's a lot of caution with using AI to learn languages. I would say if you want to practice automaticity, I think it's a good avenue for that. You can, and I will add right here, the quality of the prompts you give to the AI. I was just going to say, if you say, I just want to chat in this language, your chat's going to
Mhm.
have a good quality. It's not going to be a quality, I should say. What would result in better quality is crafting the prompt to say, I would like to role play with you. I'm going to be this role and you're going to be that role. And then you tell the AI actually, be
Oh,
difficult with me, like push back on me. You have to tell
okay.
it to do that directly.
It will.
And it will. So you just have to A, focus on automaticity, and B, craft your prompt to make sure that the AI understands exactly the kind of interaction you want. Any language learner can give the prompt to AI to create an
Mhm.
activity to help
Okay.
them practice. What I would say with AI again, though, is remember, it's going to agree with you too much. AI also suffers from what's called hallucination, where it will make up information for the sake of
Mhm.
expediency. So AI always will prioritize speed over accuracy. So if you ask it for factual information, lots of that factual information is actually
Wow.
incorrect. And I think we have to add here, since we're talking about language, remember that AI has mostly been trained on English. I believe the major language models have had upwards of 30 billion tokens in English. English is a very widely spoken language. If you try to use AI to learn a less commonly taught language like
Mhm.
Polish, for example, there are only 40 million or so dominant speakers of Polish on Earth. It would take them upwards of half a century to produce the same amount of tokens that are currently available in English. So the point of this is that AIs are not trained very
Mhm.
well on less commonly taught languages, and those errors then accumulate very rapidly. So I would say if you want to learn a commonly taught language like French or Spanish, AI can help you more than if you need to
Oh,
learn a less
that's a
commonly
really
taught
important point.
language. So that's something to
And
keep in
also,
mind.
so what I'm hearing is basically AI can serve as an important resource, especially in the beginning, to develop more of that memorized proficiency and how to respond in very typical communicative types of situations.
Chapter 6, No One Language Program Works.
I think from what I've understood from learners' motivation and learners' understanding of how to learn a language when there's so many options available in the current language program market, is there a panacea to learning language, like a single program or a best approach? Or is it just pulling from different parts of the language learning universe? What do you think about that?
So if we think about
Mm-hmm.
systems of government, no single
Mm-hmm.
ism works,
Yeah.
in my opinion. Capitalism by itself doesn't work. Communism by itself doesn't work. Socialism by itself doesn't work. You have to blend
Okay.
isms. The same is true for language
Mm-hmm.
learning. You have to blend theories. There's no one approach to language learning. The most basic thing that I would say aspect or dimension of language learning, though, is this idea that you are taking forms and attaching them to meanings. That's called form meaning connections. That is the basis of all language learning. You have to attach meaning to what you hear or read, right? So the sound sequence, d, g, right? When you hear that sound sequence, you picture the animal. So you are taking the meaning, the essence of what that means, and attaching it to that sound sequence. Anything that helps you do that is going to help you learn a language. So whatever approach it is, there has to be this form meaning connection being made. So there are many ways to do this. You can do something like Duolingo that has you translating. I'm not sure that's the most efficient way to do it, but it does help you create form meaning connection. You can do it in a social situation in class where you are using the language for a concrete purpose. You're learning which meanings attach to which forms and when to use them. So as long as you're doing that, you're going to have some success. And again, if you're motivated, if you do it every day, you see how it's like a multi-part puzzle. If you're creating form meaning connection and you're doing that every day and you're doing it for a concrete purpose and you're getting feedback. So not only do you have to meaning connections, you have to negotiate meaning. So anytime you are negotiating meaning, you're also helping your language learning. So let's not forget about the role of feedback. I'm not saying a corrected paper, like a teacher would correct your paper with a red pen, but if someone says to me in a cafe and I'm like a basic learner, I'm like, what? Right? So you have to get feedback and also give it in a sense. So you have to negotiate.
Real-time feedback, and it needs to be tempered. It needs to be relatively moderate.
I feel like feedback when it's strong creates a good memory. Like if I say something in Spanish and the person I'm talking to goes, me, that's a strong message that what I said was not understood.
But if it's
changed,
too excessive and constant, I think it could create some sense of like, oh, I'm really messing up a lot. I should just think more before I speak, and that goes to your point of communication needs to be quick, especially in the beginning stages. You need to be quick. But when you're overthinking things because you're afraid to make a mistake. So I think the feedback, the whole idea of feedback, but having a good partner, a good conversation partner, a tutor that can provide that feedback is important.
But you do need those hard lessons. You have to learn to pick yourself back up again. Think about when you were a kid and riding a bike. If you fell off that bike, that was a hard lesson to learn, but you picked yourself up, dusted yourself off, and got back on the bike.
Chapter 7. What does language fluency look like?
This leads into our next question, which is, you hear a lot about like become fluent in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 3 months. What does this really mean to become fluent, for example, in 3 months? What does that look like?
I don't know, actually. A non-professional reading of the term fluent implies a lot of things, whereas if you're a language professional, fluency only really refers to how quickly you speak and how smoothly you speak. So the amount of pauses, are those pauses natural? Are you stammering? Are you searching for words? That's what the technical sort of professional definition of fluency is. But these things are marketed toward people who are not language professionals. So when someone says I'm fluent in Spanish and they're not a language professional, that just means that they in their estimation, because they're self-reporting, they speak it well enough to communicate.
Okay.
So if we think well enough to communicate, if we think about our common language scales, right? So let's start with the ACTFL scale. Well enough to communicate starts, in my opinion, at what's called intermediate high. And if you Google the ACTFL guidelines, it'll explain them to you. But intermediate high is someone who can, tell a little story. They can give you some instructions. They can have a casual conversation with you, starting about intermediate high. If the US government uses the ILR scale, I would say true communication starts at about level 2 on that scale. And then if we're talking CEFR, I don't have as much experience with CEFR, but from what I understand and, research this, listeners, but I believe the idea of true communication starts
Mhm.
at B1. B as in Bravo, B1, right? So can you achieve intermediate high /2/B1 in 30
No,
days? No,
no.
not in my estimation. Those would have to be a hardcore 30
Yeah.
days where you are doing language like every day, 8 hours a
Yeah.
day, 4 hours a day, 6 days a week. So that's 24 hours a week times 12,
Mhm.
right? So 4 weeks in a month. What's 24 times 12? So 2 times 24 is 48. 10 times is 240. So what's that, about
Mhm.
288? Check my math. Let's say it's
Mhm.
about 300 hours. If you were doing Spanish or French, something that's sort of has the same alphabet, has
Mhm.
a lot of cognates to it, or a less commonly taught language like Norwegian or Dutch, which is
Mhm.
very closely related to English, you could achieve intermediate status, maybe like 1+ish on the ILR, of
Mhm.
A2 on the Sephir scale. You could
Okay.
achieve. Is that fluent in layman's terms or non-professional terms? It's just short of it. So I would take a lot of commercial language learning claims with a
Okay.
grain of
Good. Good.
salt. I will say that if you lean in hard, you can become fluent. Again, in the non-professional sense, you can become fluent relatively quickly in some languages. Now, if you're learning a language that's more distant from English, like Arabic, which uses a different alphabet, a different grammatical system, very different grammatical system. If you're learning something like Chinese, going to have to spend extra time invested in the writing system in order to, be able to read things. I don't know if that 3-month claim would hold. I think it would probably be closer to
Okay.
6. Again, me, you can do it 4 hours a day. So I would take commercial language learning timelines with a grain of salt.
Chapter 8. Don't obsess over pronunciation.
And let's go on to the next question. Why do teachers and language programs place so much emphasis on pronunciation and native-like fluency? Seems like between the AI tutors and a lot of the programs make that kind of like that is the pinnacle of fluency, is being able to make your pronunciation sound more native-like. It seems like it's something that's eye-catching when,
Yeah.
for language programs.
Yeah. I would say that hasn't been my experience. I've known more people who focused a lot on grammar. But when it comes to pronunciation, like grammar, if your pronunciation is too far away from, if it's too deviant, it
Mhm.
impacts the message. Right? So I would say as long as your pronunciation is not impacting the message, you're doing pretty well. If you have the personal goal of wanting to sound more precise with your,
Mhm.
let's say, phonetic features, because it's more than just the pronunciation of the individual sounds. There's intonation, there's what's called suprasegmental, so phenomena that extend across word
Mhm.
boundaries. And then if you're learning language that's tonal, right, your pronunciation can actually
Mhm.
severely impact the message. So I think that you might see more emphasis on pronunciation in languages
Yeah.
where you have this potential to cause a
Yeah.
communication breakdown. If you want to become better at your pronunciation, one of the best ways is to take a segment of a movie or a
Mhm.
television show that's in the language you're learning, or maybe even a TED Talk, depending on what your interests are, and take 90 seconds of that, whatever it is, that TED Talk or that movie or that television show, and memorize the script, even with the gestures that you're seeing, and
Mhm.
practice. And do that many, many, many times with different segments, and your pronunciation will improve
Wow,
immensely.
that's great advice, Dan.
So I would say everything has to
Mhm.
be in a balance. So if I can't get a message out, then I can't communicate. And so if my anxiety about grammar or pronunciation or vocabulary or whatever aspect of language gives me
Mhm.
anxiety, if that's getting in the way of me even expressing a message, then you have a problem there. And I would say overemphasis on any element of language is
Mhm.
not great. Perfect is the enemy of
Yeah.
good enough. So remember, communication is also a two-way street. So you're going to have to take into account the other person's, you know, participation. And if you're too slow, if you're stammering, even if what you say is grammatically perfect, it still might
Mhm.
not carry your message. So there has to
It
be
seems like in English, there's probably a lot more flexibility than, let's say, Thai. Like I lived in Thailand for 2 years, and I attempted to learn Thai, and it's a tonal language, and my hearing is not like it used to be, and I struggled. And you're right, it did impact my message.
If you're coming from a language that doesn't use it as a strategy for meaning making, then tonal, and also remember that, I mean, pretty much after the age of 6, it becomes very difficult to hear features of a language that are not part of your dominant language. So since your dominant language is probably English, right? So, tone is not a meaning making strategy for English. So we don't listen for it. So to us, all the tones, when they're pronounced slowly and out of context, we can hear the difference between tones in languages like Thai, Chinese, Burmese. But in authentic speech, we don't hear the tones as well as English speakers. So it will be challenging. But again, practice makes perfect. You have to practice.
Chapter 9, the role of language immersion.
Okay, so that goes into very, very a fascinating topic. It's something that I have a lot of experience with, and I imagine you do as well, learning other languages. As linguists, it's very important to learn other languages, and it's very important to be immersed in the target language culture. So I learned all the languages that I've learned. I've studied and learned about 10 languages to varying degrees of course, fluency and proficiency. So my first immersion experience was going to Paraguay as a Peace Corps volunteer, living there for 2 years. And I eventually lived there for about 5 years total. And so I learned profoundly about the value of immersion, about being in the target language culture. And I've reproduced that experience in other countries. Like I learned Russian in Ukraine. I learned Thai in Thailand. I learned how to speak French more fluently living in Gabon and Africa. And so this whole idea of immersion, how does someone immerse themselves in the target language when they often don't have that opportunity to live in a country where that language is spoken? What are your ideas on that?
So if you live in the United States, there are communities where these languages are spoken in large cities. So you want to seek out the opportunities to use the language in a more authentic context. So, for example, let's take Thai, for example. So you lived in Thailand for a while. Let's say you find yourself back in the United States. In many communities around the United States that have Thai expat population, they will center around the temple. And oftentimes those temples will have like dinners where the public can come, or lunch, and buy lunch or buy dinner and, see the temple and hang out. So you have to put yourself in the situation where you're going to use that language. So it's not, is it a full immersion? No, but it's as close as you can get without actually going to Thailand in this case. So, you have to seek out opportunities to use the language. I wouldn't discount, obviously you want to be careful making acquaintances through the internet. Obviously you want to be safe, you want to be prudent, not reveal too much information. But, if you join a community where people are discussing topics in that language, as long as you stick to the topic of discussion, right? So let's say you wanted to brush up on your French and you join an online discussion board dealing with French politics. If you join it and talk about French politics in French, the people will eventually welcome you in and you'll be able to immerse yourself in that community. If you enter that community and say, I want to practice my French, they're going to be like, get out of here. We're here to talk about politics, not teach you French. So, I think that's an important part of immersive experience too, is if you go in, it sounds kind of, I guess, weird, but if you go into an immersive experience saying, I want to practice the language, you're not going to get an authentic.
That's a really good point you make.
So my advice for this is if you can't go to a country and immerse yourself, we all have our jobs and, families and, it's not always practical to be able to pull up stakes and go live in a country. But if you engage with the community in an authentic way, you will get some immersion in their language and culture. And again, you're not going to go to the community and say, "I want to practice Thai." They'll be polite to you, but you won't get an authentic experience. Now, if you go to the Thai speaking community and you say you want to learn about their cuisine, or you're interested in their culture and you're interested in Buddhism, or, whatever context it is, you will have a more authentic experience and people will actually be more welcome.
Wow, that's a great take on how to recreate.
That's been my, if you announce that you're a language learner, people are like, "Oh, that's so cute that you want to learn our language." I mean, it's just not a great strategy. I've seen
So they're flattered, but it's like,
they'll say to you, "Why do you want to learn this language?" Nobody wants to learn this language, especially for some languages. Like, for example, if you want to learn a less commonly taught language, I had a friend who wanted to learn Dutch. And so he, immersed himself in Dutch culture. But whenever he would say, "I want to practice Dutch," they'd be like, "Why?" I mean, they know you're a language learner when you open your mouth. So no need to announce it.
Chapter 10, Culture of Error.
I base a lot of my teaching strategies and philosophy on my own experiences of being immersed and learning different languages, and the way I learned Spanish very quickly, the way I learned Portuguese, the way I learned French and other languages, is that I wasn't afraid to make mistakes. How do you respond to teachers mainly who say, or learners, if you're making mistakes, you're doing it wrong?
I mean, how do I respond to that? I would say that, obviously, if you're making mistakes, you're doing something wrong. So I don't know. The phrasing's kind of strange, but I would say what they're afraid of, I think, is if you make mistakes, the mistakes will stick. My view on that is language is not a habit formation process, right? So language errors don't get embedded because you make them long. People fossilize or sort of get stuck in their language learning process because actually they're not getting enough quality input. So a lot of research shows that fossilization is not due to making errors. Fossilization is due to lack of input and lack of quality feedback. So if you think about someone who emigrates to a country, they usually reach a point where they're communicating in the language of that country. It's imperfect, but it's communication. And so they stop receiving feedback on what they're saying, and they reach a point where people are comfortable enough conversing with them where they don't have to give them any more feedback. So I would say it's about quantity of feedback, but it's also about quality. So if we're talking about language instruction, instructed language is a little bit different than naturalistic language learning. In naturalistic circumstances, you're almost never going to get feedback unless what you say is completely incomprehensible. Most people will just let things slide. Or you'll get feedback in naturalistic context, you'll get feedback that's very vague. Like, "You sound like an American." It's not really, it doesn't really help me. But in an instructed context, what you want to do is, again, you want to pick your battles. As a language instructor, you don't want to correct everything. You want to make sure that you're focusing on something that's level appropriate. So for beginners, word choice is always something you want to correct. If someone's using the wrong word, right, that can severely impact the message. So I had students who told me they were going to try on soup. And I was like, "You're not trying on the soup, you're trying the soup." Right? So you want to make sure they're using their correct words. And then as they continue in their language trajectory, you want to adjust the feedback based on that trajectory. So, as they get further down the road, then you start questioning sort of grammatical uses that really impact meaning. And then maybe if they're trying to polish their language skills, then you start to question choices that don't necessarily impact meaning, but make things sound ugly, as one of my colleagues used to put it. Like, it's not wrong, it just sounds ugly, right? If we want to make it pretty, that's a goal for a more advanced learner, but I digress. So what I would say too is, if you're a language instructor, you want to do what's called a gradual contingent exchange. So instead of just correcting the person, what you want to do is you want to, even if you do understand them, if it's something you want to make a point about, you pretend not to. So, if a student says something like, "El calle es estrecho," you can say something like, "I'm sorry, what?" Get them to repeat it again. And then as you go through the exchange, you narrow down on the thing you want them to
less intrusive feedback.
Yeah. And so you give them examples. You would say, like if someone wanted to learn how to say like, I'm from this place, right? Or también, ¿de dónde es usted? You just keep repeating it. You give them examples, and it's gradual in that you narrow in on the error that you want to focus on. And then it's contingent in the sense of once they say the target way of saying it,
Exactly.
you leave it, you move on. No lecture, remember that when you do, you have to do it like this. No metalinguistic explanation, you just move on. Gradual and contingent exchanges are very effective ways of delivering feedback in an instructed context. Now, no one's going to ensure that as a language learner, you are, though, getting some sort of feedback in the sense of how is my message being received? You definitely need that. But if it's excessive, it's not going to help. There's only so much that your brain or a language learner's brain can keep track of.
So Dan, this has been a great conversation about how to study a language, all the different nuances and different strategies that can be utilized to optimize the time that one person dedicates to language learning, because most of us don't have a lot of time to dedicate ourselves to learning a language. But there's one thing I was curious about, Dan, is who's someone in the field of linguistics who you really admire?
So I would say that the person who shaped my view of language the most was my first advisor I had, which was Dr. Bill VanPatten,
BVP.
who is sort of the BVP. He's an eminent scholar in second language acquisition, and he was my professor for teaching methods. And he used to do this thing with us called live coaching when we were learning to teach, where you would teach a lesson and he would stop you in the middle and say, go back and do it again. This is what you need to do it again. And so in a sense, it was, again, that idea of practice makes perfect. And he applied it to all aspects of learning, no matter what we were learning, whether it's language learning, whether it's learning to teach, whether, any kind of discipline that requires sort of a procedural skill to it, like how to do something. He was very focused on, repetition, but also that's where I really got this idea of key of form meaning connection. So before I started my program, and this was at University of Illinois, before I started my program, I had a very sort of old-fashioned view of language learning that had been instilled in me in high school. Like, you got to do all these drills and you got to, memorize all this stuff and you got to spit it back out on tests. It's not going to help you learn a language. It's going to teach you about a language, but it's not going to teach you to use the language. So he really opened my eyes to this idea of, again, making those form meaning connections, learning to attach meaning to what you hear or see is the key. And however you do that is going to be, it's going to pay off. And then this idea of using language for a concrete purpose, right? You have to have a reason for everything you say. We don't just talk for no reason. So yeah, I mean, he really shaped my ideas about it. And he also was very conscientious about showing us all kinds of theories about language learning, not just his own ideas on it, but also, his advisor was Stephen Krashen, who's another eminent scholar.
Oh yeah, just Stephen Krashen, another eminent.
Krashen. I always say that I'm Stephen Krashen's academic grandson, because he was my advisor's advisor. So, but he was very conscientious about exposing us to like other viewpoints within language learning, because he was also a big believer in that there's more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one way to learn a language. The key is whatever method you use, it has to be making form meaning connections, and it has to have.
Well, that's a great way. That's a great way to end this phenomenal conversation about language learning.
Chapter 12, Last Remarks, Persistence and Discipline.
So before I let you go, Dan, any final thoughts on how someone could break the barrier of fluency in another language and reach their goals?
I can't emphasize persistence and discipline. When I was learning Spanish, I was very lucky to be able to do that in an immersive environment. But even in an immersive environment, you have to be disciplined. So where I lived, there were a group of Americans. If you're living in a place that has Americans, it's going to be very tempting to hang out all together and do American things together. You have to shun
the language
Americans.
bubble.
There's 350 million Americans in the United States. Like you can hang out with them
Yeah.
anytime. If you get the chance to do something immersive,
Mhm.
really immerse yourself. So I made
Mhm.
Spanish friends. I ate Spanish food. I lived the life. And it's hard. I think one of the hardest things is culture shock. No matter how progressive or open-minded you think you are, you will experience culture shock. Trust me, it goes away.
Mhm.
First, when you experience a new culture, you're very excited. I'm experiencing this culture. It's always been a goal of mine for a while. And then you hit the hard reality that the people you're interacting with are
Mhm.
human beings and they come in all shades. There's nice people, there's kind people, and then there's
Mhm.
real jerks. And you're going to come up against customs and perspectives and practices that are sometimes even
Yeah.
repellent to you. So there's that, like I mentioned before, U-shaped behavior. That's the bottom. That's when you're like, I am tired of looking at this place. I'm tired of looking at these people. We're being real. But trust me, that goes away. And when you come back up the other side, you see this other culture, you embrace this otherness, and you see it for, the totality that it is in a sense, It is a human experience. It's going to have high points, joyous points, and it's going to have low points where you are depressed and you think you can't handle it anymore. It's a human experience just like any other. You just have to roll with it. So I would say
Mm.
persistence and discipline are your
Yeah.
friends.
Out of all the countries where I learned how to speak the language in an immersion like experience, those are the countries that I enjoy visiting again and again. Coming back to Colombia and Spain and Paraguay and Thailand and Greece. I love returning to those countries where I had the chance to really immerse myself in the culture and learn the language. Dan, it's been great talking to you over this last hour.
Likewise.
And I'd love to have you on again to really talk about some specific topics perhaps in the future and
Sure.
go get a little bit deeper into the language learning issues. Thank you so much for being on WiseBox podcast. Say that 10 times.
WiseBox
WiseBox
podcast.
podcast. And you have a wonderful day.
Dude, thanks for having me.
This is WiseBox Podcast.